Welcome back to In a Tiny Garden. Today we'll be starting out at the allotment to plant out some of the things that we sowed in the very first week. And then we'll be direct sowing some carrots and parsnips and a couple more cut flowers. And then we're going to come back here to sow some more beetroot and maybe a couple other things. So I hope you enjoy. First, we're just going to have a quick look at what's been germinating since last week and growing. The most exciting of which are the tomatoes that have germinated, all but a couple varieties. And I'm just going to remove the weaker seedling of the two because we planted 2 seeds into each module. And that'll let the stronger one grow on into a plant. And I'm just patting down the soil around the top of the roots of the one that remains, just in case any of the soil is disturbed from removing the other seedling. And then I'm taking them off the heated propagator and letting the ones that haven't germinated yet stay on the heated propagator to see if they will. And it's been tough keeping these guys watered. I really don't like the pellets. The ones in the trays have been much easier. Sungella still hasn't come up in either of forms of sowing, but never mind, I'll sow some more. And the celeriac and celery have come up really nicely, so those will stay inside for a long time yet, and they need to be kept quite moist. And they'll be potted up, pricked out and potted up soon. And then the luffa, I took out the weaker seedling, and we're letting this one grow on, so it's kind of exciting. Fingers crossed for this one. The sweet potato slips are doing really well and should be ready maybe next week or the week after to plant up individually. And then outside in the cold frame, the brassicas are still growing away. And the peas and sweet peas are doing really well. I could actually plant those out if I had my supports ready. And then just keeping lettuce and everything else watered. And then we'll have a look at what we're going to take to the allotment. So firstly, we're going to plant this tray at the allotment, including the peas for shoots that have a really good root ball, along with the bolt hardy beetroot that could have waited a little longer in this tray to really fill it out with its roots, and the spinach. But let's go. So at the allotment, I just make sure that it's well weeded before I get started. And as I'll be direct sowing in between these rows, ideally I would have raked to a fine tilth before this, but I forgot my rake. Also, it can be easier to use string and bamboo to make nice straight lines, but I'm just freehanding it here with my hori before I get started. So just kind of guiding out how much space I've got on the end of this bed here, where I'm going to be sowing my root vegetables, along with a couple other things for salads like the pea shoots, and I might plant some of the lettuces here later on as well. I plan roughly what my beds are going to be, but it always changes when it comes down to it. So I've got my plan, but it's a very loose plan. So I'm just going to get started by making a hole, and then I'm going to gently pop out the spinach and pop it in. I plant quite deeply, which just protects the seedling. I make sure that just a little bit of the base is covered by the mulch layer. And then I give it a good pat down to make sure that the roots have good contact with the soil. And then I'm spacing them about 15 centimeters apart. And, I do look at the back of the packet sometimes, but also it's sort of up to how you're growing and that sort of thing. Every space is going to be different as to how close you grow. Are you multi-sowing? That sort of thing. And are you using these as cut and come again, in which case you can space them closer. But if you want them to grow on into adult plants, then you might space them a little bit further apart, like the 15 centimeters. So because I've multi-sowed them, I'm doing the full 15 centimeters apart. The ground at my plot is quite stony, so any I hit with the trowel I just remove by hand. And I'll be using them around a pond this year. This variety of spinach I'm using is called Madania. So this isn't one of the perpetual spinaches. This is just an annual, a hardy annual. And the best time to sow it is between February and April, and then you shouldn't really sow it between April and August in the hottest months because it can bolt really easily. And this actually happened to me last year. So I'm trying to get it in the ground a bit earlier. And then you can sow again sort of late summer, August/September, and it's a great one because it can withstand the frosts outside and you can have winter harvests. And then I'm going to plant out my peas for shoots, about 30 centimeters away from the spinach because I'm going to sow some carrots in between. I just tried to tease the roots a little bit there, but actually they didn't really need it because these containers that I'm using have such big holes in the bottom that they actually kind of air prune themselves, so they're not pot bound at all, which is great. And I'm dropping them in quite deeply again, just like the spinach, which sort of anchors them just up to the same level or slightly above, and then putting the compost mulch just around them and tucking them in nicely. So I should be able to harvest maybe about 3 times from these. And as you can see, I actually already have harvested some of them a little bit early, but I got a bit carried away, which is fab. So just to add them to the rest of the salad mix is so tasty. So I've got 8 pea plants here, and I had 16 spinach plants. And now I'm going to plant my beetroot out with 30 centimeters between each row and then 15 centimeters between each clump. And I'm planting using the multi-sowing technique, which I learned from Charles Dowding a few years ago. And it's really, really good and maximizes your harvest. You harvest one at a time. So you start with kind of maybe a golf ball size one, and then you let the rest of the clump grow on, and so forth. So the last one that you harvest will probably be the biggest, and it means that you've got quite a long succession. I'm actually just pulling out a couple extra ones because I want maybe 4 or 5 per clump here. And I've planted quite deeply again, so the compost on the top, or the mulch, will come up right to the base, just above the very base of the seedlings. So they'll be nice and kind of supported and firm them in. I'll give everything a really good water at the end. And it's been really encouraging to see how many earthworms there still are here, especially with the no-dig method. There's so many. You have to be careful where you put your trowel. So now I'm just grabbing the radish, which are the last things that we'll plant out, and then we'll start direct sowing some seeds. So the roots are really quite long on these already. I probably could have planted them out a while ago. And the first one I'm doing here is blue moon radish, which is actually a good one for autumn sowing as well, but I'm just going to try it as spring. And I've actually divided the little clumps that I had into 2, breaking up the paper pot that they're in a little bit at the same time. So you can see that here, because there really are quite a few here. And the blue moon and red moon radish get quite big. Versus the others, like Pink Beauty and Palenza, will be perfect for this sort of method. They're nice and small. And then we're going to direct sow some carrots. So I've got 4 varieties, which are great for early sowing, like the Nantes. And we'll be sowing a couple other varieties maybe in a few weeks' time for a successional sowing. So this one is going in between the peas and the spinach. So there's about 30 centimeter gap there, which means 15 centimeters either side of the carrot. And I'm sowing quite thinly or sparingly for the carrots because you don't want to have to do a lot of thinning, because the smell of pulling out the seedlings that you need to thin attracts carrot root fly, which is my biggest sort of carrot nemesis on the allotment. In order to overcome this, I put a very fine mesh down that's called EnviroMesh later on. But first here, I'm going to put Fleece down until they start growing a bit more, just to keep them warm. And then the EnviroMesh that goes on will be 60 centimeters high because carrot root fly can't fly any higher than that. But you could just cover it completely using hoops. It just depends what you have and what kind of works for you. But sowing thinly is the first step, even though carrots can be a bit erratic at germinating. We'll see what we get. And ideally I would have raked the ground, like I said, to a nice fine tilth before sowing, but I'm pretty happy with how it is, and I forgot my rake anyway. So I'm just squeezing some right onto the end of the bed, and then I'm going to cover them over. So they're about 10 millimeters deep, and then I just cover them over, and then I make sure that it has good contact with the ground. So just patting gently to make sure the seeds kind of come in contact with the soil nicely, and I'll water at the end. Ideally, you would have watered before you sowed, but my ground was quite wet underneath the mulch there, so it was okay. And then I'm going to do another row in between the beetroot and the pea shoots, because again, the pea shoots will be finished much before the carrots start swelling. Little things like this really do maximize your space. And then I'm putting the rest of them back so I'm not tempted to oversow. And now is a great time to start planting your parsnip as well, because it needs really long growing season. And last year I used this trick because germination is really erratic and takes quite a long time. So I just dampened some paper towel, and then as soon as I see the little radicle come out, I sow them out at the allotment. And here I'm doing about 3 seeds per little planting hole, but you can do them in a line like the carrots as well. It just kind of depends. And then I'll plant another row in a couple weeks, because right next to the radish, because the radish will crop way before the parsnips are ready. And my parsnips I'm actually still eating from last year, so they stand all winter, and then I've been harvesting kind of throughout the winter since Christmas. So it would be about 15 to 20 centimeter between rows, and then a final thinning distance to about 10 centimeters. So each of my little holes was about 10 centimeters apart. And that's parsnip tender and true, which is a really good one to start. This is the cut flower bed. So you have the roses just waking up in the middle. I've got 4 plants, and I've planted a lot of tulips this year as well. So we're going to direct sow some seeds here and also plant out what we have in the garden. So we've got the Ranunculus and Anemones, and they're going to go out in the bed here as well. And the other 2 trays I have are going to go out in the garden. So I've just made a planting hole. These are really kind of beyond ready to go out. You can see how many roots are at the bottom. The holes in the bottom of these modules are really small, so I think they got quite root bound. But hopefully they're going to be okay, fingers crossed. So these are from corms we planted, I think in the very first episode. And then I'm just going to firm them in, kind of hold their leaves up while I do this. And these are right at the end of the bed. So I haven't really paid attention to the spacing here. But, you know, I just kind of judged how big I think a ranunculus plant will get. I haven't grown them out in the allotment before, only in the garden. So this is kind of new, this big cut flower bed. And then I'm planting out the anemones. In between, where I can find space between all the tulips. Exactly the same as I did the ranunculus. And you can actually see here there is a lot of fungal activity because of the mulch that I used, which is great. So it kind of looks like lacy kind of strands of white that you'll see quite well in a second. And that means the soil is alive and teeming with health, which is just fantastic. And teasing the roots again. So you can see just on top of that pile there, the kind of white, kind of fluffy cord looking things are actually mycelial cords, and they are like rhizomorphs or roots, and they kind of have the same sort of function as roots. And again, it means that we've got really healthy soil, and these came from the compost layer that I put on top, which was well-rotted manure and compost. So some plants actually use these cords underground to communicate with one another and share nutrients and things like that, and warn each other of pests and diseases. Next, we're going to direct sow some cut flowers, including Larkspur and Ammi visnaga. And the Larkspur, some of the seeds I put in the fridge for a couple weeks to cold stratify, but you don't necessarily need to do this. And I'm going to sow some that I cold stratified and some that I didn't. But first are the Ammi visnaga, which should be white and really nice kind of fillers for bouquets. This is my first time growing on both these, so we'll see how they do. I'm trying to find some space in between the tulip and rose here. And these ones I didn't need to cold stratify, but they're best sown directly into the ground, which is why I didn't start them off in modules any earlier. So I'm putting them in 2 different places in this bed, the cut flower bed. So that's the Larkspur sown as well. And then I'm going to give everything a really good water. So it's really important to give everything a really good soak, especially seeds you've just sown like carrots and parsnips. And it's really good to keep the carrots and parsnips kind of moist until they germinate. So sometimes you can cover them over with a piece of wood, but then you need to check it all the time to make sure that it's not kind of smushing them down after they've germinated. So here I'm just going to put down some fleece, which will keep everything kind of warm, and because they were in the cold frame, I did harden them off, but it'll be nice just to kind of cut down on the wind while they're at the allotment for their first kind of couple weeks in the ground. And then because I've planted some carrots here as well, I will, like I said, have to use a mesh around. So, and because the parsnips are on the end, they get affected by carrot root fly as well. So this whole area might get mesh. And now we're going to sow some beetroot to finish off. So I'm quite obsessed with beetroot. I'm sowing 8-9 different varieties this year. So we've just put 2 in the ground, and those are ones that are quite useful for sowing early in the year that are bolt resistant, like bolt hardy. I love beetroot, the shape of beetroot seeds, the little clusters, they're so fascinating. So the Detroit and the bolt hardy can be sown outside directly in March with some frost protection, but then main crop beetroot, which are these 8 that I'm about to sow, can be direct sown outdoors from April. But sowing in modules like this indoors to start out with means that you get a bit of a head start. So the seeds are going about 1 centimeter down, and then I'm also going to sow some spinach, the same variety that we just planted out. It's really important to keep up your successional sowing, so that's why kind of doing these videos is actually going to be quite helpful. And then I'm covering them over. I'm actually using these pellets one last time because these are the last ones I've got. So they're all planted about 1 centimeter down, and then I'm just kind of mushing the compost around them, firming it in. And then I need to make sure that these are kept well watered because they dry out really, really quickly in these little pellets. So thanks so much for watching. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.